Welcome to another episode of Be Right, our human rights news. Start from Bahrain with Bahraini prosecution demanded convicting Sheikh Ali Salman over charge of promoting to change regime by force. Attorney General Haroon al-Zayani announced that the appeal hearing of the Secretary General of one of Bahrain's political societies, Sheikh Ali Salman, has begun on Tuesday following a conviction of inciting non-compliance with the law, publicly inciting hatred, an act which had disturbed public peace and insulting a statutory body. In the framework of its investigations, the public prosecution looked into recordings of public speeches and sermons attributed to the defendant. He was also questioned in the presence of 4 lawyers. The prosecution confronted him with these recordings that include a public call not to abide by the rules with regards to places of protest and urging the Ulama Islamic Council to proceed in its activities, as well as incitement against naturalized Bahraini citizens, accusing them of disloyalty and terrorist acts. GCC to take measures against states that condemned human rights violations in Bahrain. The Gulf Cooperation Council condemned the joint statement issued by the United Nations Human Rights Council that was delivered by the Swiss Federation on behalf of a number of states that condemned human rights violations in Bahrain. A Gulf meeting said that this statement includes a lot of false information and allegations about human rights. It failed to acknowledge the tangible progress documented in official reports which were issued recently. And regionally, after clashes, Israel to clamp down on Palestinian stone throwers. After 3 days of clashes at one of Jerusalem's main holy sites, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed Wednesday to clamp down on Palestinian stone throwers and impose harsher measures to restore calm. On a tour of some of the main flashpoints in and around Jerusalem, Netanyahu said the new steps would include giving security personnel wider powers to deal with stone throwers, imposing tougher legal penalties, and introducing fines for perpetrators and their families. Saeb Erekat, Secretary General of the Palestine Liberation Organization, said Israel had inflamed the situation by attempting to turn Jerusalem into an exclusively Jewish city and erase Palestinian history. He said the clashes at the mosque were the worst since 1969. And in Hungary, hundreds of migrants smashed their way through the razor wire border with Serbia. After an afternoon of battles in which Hungarian riot police launched tear gas and unleashed water cannons on the thousands of migrants gathered along the country's border with Serbia, many finally managed to break through the new 13-feet-high fences. Yesterday evening, the crowd were seen pouring through the border crossing while Hungarian police reinforcements sheltered behind their riot gear. However, fresh batches of tear gas sent panic into the crowd, with the refugees either beaten back or held in no man's land between the two countries. The confrontation has threatened to cause a political row, with the United Nations Secretary General and Serbian government officials joining human rights groups in condemning Hungary's actions. Coming next, Bahrain turns a deaf ear again. In 2012, Bahrain received 176 recommendations in its second universal periodic review, of which it fully accepted 145 recommendations and partially accepted 13 recommendations. Bahrain asserted in its response to the universal periodic review recommendations that it had dropped all charges related to freedom of expression and that the authorities have taken steps to investigate past and present human rights abuses. The recommendations Bahrain accepted included more than a dozen, calling on the government to hold security forces accountable for rights abuses, including wrongful deaths and mistreatment of detainees in government custody. Other recommendations called for the immediate release of prisoners convicted solely for exercising their rights to peaceful assembly and free speech during pro-democracy demonstrations in March 2011. We'll discuss further, but first, let's watch this report about the 5th UN Joint Statement on Human Rights in Bahrain.
For the 5th time, states join a joint statement recognizing a long list of human rights abuses in Bahrain. On the 14th of September of the current year, led by Switzerland, which raises the persistent concerns of the international community regarding a wide variety of human rights abuses in Bahrain, including the ongoing use of torture, excessive and indiscriminate use of force, and restrictions on the freedom of opinion, expression and assembly. This latest joint statement builds on 4 previous joint statements in the Human Rights Council since 2012, which raised similar concerns and enjoy a growing coalition of cross-regional support. The 33 states called on Bahrain to take action to substantively address these concerns. The states called on the government to fully implement the recommendations of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry (BICI) and Bahrain's Second Cycle Universal Periodic Review, as well as for enhanced cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights (OHCHR) and the UN Special Procedures. 5 joint statements have been made on Bahrain at the Human Rights Council since 2012, and a growing number of states are showing support for addressing these ongoing issues in that region. Since 2013, all of the statements have enjoyed the full support of all European Union member states, in addition to Switzerland, the United States, and a growing list of Latin American, African, and Asian states.
So the government always claims that it has implemented more than 90% of the UPR recommendations, as well as the BICI recommendations. But the fact is that the government did not implement the UPR recommendations in essence, but indeed committed serious abuses of human rights on larger scale. The outcome of the Bahrain's UPR, through which all UN member countries are examined once every 4 years, was adopted by the Human Rights Council on September 19, 2012. The written statement presents a brief assessment of selected UPR recommendations, implementation in Bahrain, and calls Human Rights Council members to urge the Bahraini government to fully implement them. Now we're going to display some of these recommendations and how far were they implemented, starting with the ratification of conventions, lifting reservations, and accepting optional protocols. Well, the government did not ratify any conventions nor lifted any reservations. 2. Death penalty. The death penalty is not abolished. 3. Incorporate into national law Bahrain's obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Well, Bahrain's juvenile law was amended to indicate that the parents of anyone under the age of 15 who takes part in a demonstration, public gathering, or sit-in would receive a written warning from the Ministry of Interior. If a second offense is recorded within 6 months, the child's father could face jail, a fine, or both. Thus, the amendment puts responsibility on parents instead of protecting children participants in protests. 4. Align the national legislation on freedom of expression, association, and assembly with countries' international human rights obligation. Bahrain did not align the national legislation on freedom of expression, association, and assembly with countries' international human rights obligations. The government even abuses the existing law on assembly and demonstrations by refusing to observe notification for assembly and demonstration. 5. Amend any article of its penal code that can be used to prosecute individuals for the exercise of the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, or association, and bring its laws into line with international standards established by the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. Well, the penal code is toughened. The sentences for the exercise of the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, or association, contrary to international standards established by the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and Victims, are in hundreds. 6. Include opposition parliamentary groups and invite civil society in the implementation of the National Consensus Dialogue. No opposition parliamentary groups exist after the resignation of Al-Wifaq opposition bloc, and independent civil society is excluded from dialogue with officials. 7. Establish an adequate time frame and a transparent follow-up mechanism for an accelerated implementation of the recommendations by the Independent Commission of Inquiry. No adequate time frame and a transparent follow-up mechanism for an accelerated implementation of the recommendations by the Independent Commission of Inquiry were taken. 8. Step up its cooperation with special procedures mandate holders by responding positively to the visit requests of the special reporters, including Special Reporter on Torture. Till now, there is no real cooperation with special procedures mandate holders, and Bahrain is not responding positively to the visit requests of the special reporters, including Special Reporter on Torture. Those were some of the UPR recommendations that were not implemented in Bahrain. Wish we had more time to display others recommendations that were not implemented, and we should thank the Bahrain Forum for Human Rights for the information given to this episode. Dear viewers, to talk more about the Human Rights Council's recommendations, I'm glad to welcome the Secretary General of Sentinel for Human Rights, Tara Grady, talking to us live from Geneva. Hello and welcome.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.
Thank you. First of all, have you met or discussed any of the Bahraini government's officials or Human Rights Commission in Geneva?
Yes, I have, incidentally. There's a gentleman who's one of the members of the Ministry of Interior. His first name is Jamal. I met him yesterday, was introduced to him by a mutual colleague, and he told me that he's responsible for the safety of civil society. And I said, well, then you must be exactly the man that I should speak with regards to the use of tear gas. And he said, well, who is selling the tear gas? And I replied, but look who's using the tear gas and the victims of tear gas. So we spoke for a couple of minutes, and really it is about shifting the responsibility from those who are using these weapons against civil society and the demonstrators, to trying to shift it to the people who are selling it and who would have been at the arms trade deals in the United Kingdom last week.
Do you think that this meeting...
The other members of the...
Yes, please continue.
The other members of the government who have been here have been... There are many this visit, and there has been some disruption in some of the chambers during the interventions and during the side events. There's always the attempt to make the panel be disrupted. And I have spoken to members of the security department here at the United Nations who are responsible for the safety of the delegates while they're here in the building. Apart from the fact that they are being made aware of when the side events are taking place and who is participating at the side events, the complication that the security at the United Nations is faced with is that they don't know who it is that is instigating these disruptions in the chambers. So it's a complicated process at the moment.
Well, from this conversation that you had, do you think that there was any positivity in the Bahraini government's position towards the opposition or towards the violations in general, or what?
I cannot see that there is any commitment whatsoever to making change. If you consider that on the 20th of September, the court upheld the decision to suspend all of Al-Wifaq's meetings and operations for another 3 months. Sheikh Ali Salman remains in prison. I met Mrs. Farida Ghulam here in recent days, and her husband Abraham Sharif is still in prison. They have systematically managed to close all of the opposition's offices from Ha'ak, Wa'ad, Al-Wafaq, Wafa. All of the parties are being closed down. the right to freedom of expression is being seriously muted. There are punitive measures taken against anyone who has a public profile internationally, and Nabil Rajab still has his travel suspended. If he could be here, he would be sitting in my seat discussing these things with you today. The delegations who are here from Bahrain has diminished significantly. We're very worried about when they return and the punitive measures that are going to be taken against them, because they spoke and are involved in engaging in the United Nations process. Everyone here is aware of it. The accord that was signed recently by 33 member states of the UN is hopefully going to propose a little bit more pressure on the regime. But no, I see no willingness whatsoever to uphold any of the recommendations by the United Nations. The UPR is coming up again next year, and I'm not even remotely convinced that there is any intention to change the situation in Bahrain whatsoever.
But Bahrain, talking about the UPR's recommendation, Bahrain fully accepted 143 of the 176 recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review. Why don't you think that there's any intention for a change? How do you evaluate Bahrain's commitment to those recommendations?
Why has Juan Mendez not been permitted to go into the country and do an investigation on the use of torture in the prisons, or indeed even amongst ex-prisoners? The measures that were taken in March earlier this year in Jaw prison, where there were mass beatings and tear gas shot into prison cells, young men who were living for many weeks in significant heat, like animals in tents in the courtyards of the prison, not given any access to education or any access to healthcare. So many children who remain in prison and are beaten and abused on a daily basis. It is really criminal, the behaviour and the total lack of respect for any human rights norms or the international judiciary. They say that they are respecting the United Nations and that they accept the recommendations, but there is no will whatsoever. They're not demonstrating any commitment whatsoever to upholding their side of the bargain, if you will, to the recommendations.
But as long as Bahrain asserts that it is implementing almost all of the recommendations, but on the other hand, we see all these violations that are being committed by the Bahraini government. Isn't there some kind of a contradiction in the Bahraini's position, especially regarding human rights? Doesn't the Human Rights Council see this contradiction?
Evidently, it's not hidden from anyone, but the diplomacy and the administrative handcuffs that are in place mean that this frankly psychotic behaviour of the government is tied up with international relations diplomacy and the partnering of their allies. You know, the country has its sovereignty, and you know, the international system does not allow for interference, although we see it all of the time. And the vested interest of the United Kingdom and the United States has such a significant role to play in enabling continued environment of violence that's perpetrated by the state against its own people.
I've been reading lately, and I read that the two activists, Sayyid Ahmed Al-Wadai and Michael Payne, they said in a joint article on the Optimist website that the joint statement issued by 33 states marked the last chance to demonstrate a real commitment to human rights. And they even added that if the fifth statement isn't the charm, then maybe a substantial resolution with the full support of the UN might begin to do the trick. What does the full support of the UN indicate in this case?
Well, the United Nations definitely, unequivocally supports the right of the people of Bahrain to freedom of expression and the right to self-determination, the right to assembly. And you would imagine that the government of Bahrain would take these things on board and at least show some support for those basic fundamental human rights by not arresting people for taking part in peaceful demonstrations. But what we see by interviewing the people on the ground and knowing the families who have consistent punitive measures taken against them is that the night raids are continuing. People continue to be arrested arbitrarily. People are continually tortured and beaten. I feel like this is a broken record over the last 5 years, over and over and over again. Michael Payne and Syed Ahmed Al-Wadai are fantastic examples of human rights defenders who are dedicated to supporting the opposition movement and being able to express itself. Realistically, if there was any possibility of diplomatic talks that were more meaningful than the talks about talks that had been had in recent years, perhaps with a mediator such as maybe Chatham House or somebody from the European Commission, or a member who's a special rapporteur from the United Nations here, we could maybe see some improvement. But at the moment, I can't see all of the letters and from various governments, from various non-government organisations. Yes, it creates some media pressure, but the actual productive steps that need to be taken must come from inside the country. And the people know the problem themselves. They understand how to fix it themselves. If you take the tear gas away and the weapons away and stop importing Pakistani, Jordanian and Yemeni mercenaries into the country, you provide an environment where the Bahrainis can actually speak together themselves, perhaps we can see some progress.
Tara, do you think Bahrain eventually will ignore the interests perhaps of its allies and adhere with the joint statements and the UPR recommendations or not?
Did you ask me if I thought that they would ignore?
Yes, are they going to adhere the recommendations of the UPR and the joint statements that are given in the Human Rights Council or not?
I think that you can see by my expression on my face that that's a very difficult question for me to answer. It's really anybody's guess, but I can definitely comfort you that the commitment that our organisations, all of the international human rights defenders have, that the various states who are committed to upholding human rights values and having a working international judicial system, we're not going to give up our hopes for Bahrain and that the people will have their self-determination and their right to freedom of expression, that the prisoners of conscience will all be released and that there will be a working system in Bahrain. Inevitably it will happen. We may not see it any time within the next year or two, but we're definitely committed to working towards it and partnering whoever else is willing to engage in a meaningful way.
Tara Grady, the Secretary General of Sentinel for Human Rights, I thank you so much. I know you have a busy schedule and I really appreciate you being with us on this show. Thank you so much. You were talking to us from Geneva.
I'm sorry that you had to work on Eid, and I really appreciate your work too, and I wish you Eid Mubarak.
Thank you. Thank you. Adha Mubarak and Eid Mubarak for you as well. Thank you so much. Carlos Latouf's caricature for this episode is going to be displayed right now. Let's see it. As the world witnesses the Human Rights Council's 13th session in Geneva, hopes for a better future for human rights gets high. Knowing that the Human Rights Council is an intergovernmental body within the United Nations system responsible for the promotion and protection of all human rights around the globe. Well, that's what it is normally supposed to happen, but not when the Human Rights Council's recommendations, of which guarantee the promotion of human rights, are rejected. What is even worse is when some are approved, but the government never implements them. Good night.